welcome to the deep dive, where we take a look at some really interesting stuff. Well, actually, we take your sources, the things you care about, and kind of like boil them down. We extract the core knowledge, the stuff you really need. No overload, just the good stuff to help you, stay in the loop.
And this time, we're diving deep, literally into the deep dive, right? Into a really fascinating area, all thanks to Paul G. Hiebert. His book, The Flaw of the Excluded Middle. Really makes you think. Hiebert, well, he had this really interesting background. Like, he was a missionary in India and later became this big deal academic at places like, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Fuller Theological Seminary.
Yeah, impressive guy. So what got him thinking, and what we really want to kind of dig into with you today, is it's something that at first might seem a little puzzling. When he was reading the Gospels, he noticed something about how Jesus interacted with, John the Baptist's followers. It wasn't just about logic and arguments. Jesus was demonstrating power, healing people, casting out spirits. It was like he was operating on this whole other level, different from that kind of like purely rational Western approach we're so used to.
Yeah, and that initial observation, it really got cemented in his mind because of his own experiences over in India. Early on, there was this smallpox outbreak in the village where a church elder, Elia, lived. And like Western medicine, it wasn't stopping it.
Oh, wow.
And so the villagers, they were desperate. They turned to a diviner for answers.
Makes sense in that situation.
Yeah.
So what did the diviner say?
Well, the diviner said that the goddess of smallpox, Mariamma, she was angry, really angry, and she was demanding a sacrifice, like a big one, a water buffalo.
A water buffalo. Okay, that's serious.
Yeah. And so the village elders, they started going around, collecting contributions from each household to pay for the sacrifice. And when they got to the Christian families, well, they refused, understandably.
Right, of course, they couldn't really participate in that.
No. And the reaction was, well, immediate and pretty harsh. The other villagers, they felt slighted, like they were disrespecting them, and maybe they were worried about making the goddess even angrier. So they retaliated.
What did they do?
They wouldn't let the Christian families use the village wells for water. The local merchants wouldn't sell them any food.
Oh, wow. That's a real crisis.
Yeah, a real test of their faith and, their survival. And there was Elia, this church elder. He stood firm. Even when some of the other Christians were getting scared, wondering if maybe they should just, give a little something like a symbolic offering just to ease the tension.
It's understandable. They were under so much pressure.
Yeah, can you imagine? And then, tragically, one of the young Christian girls in the village, she got sick. Smallpox. Hiebert, he found himself praying for her, but also, really feeling the weight of the situation. The whole village was watching. And he was struggling, with how to make sense of it all, how to understand what was happening.
It's got to be tough when your own worldview is being challenged like that. So this whole experience, this intense situation, it got Hiebert thinking. And combined with his earlier observations about Jesus' ministry, it led him to this really fundamental question, one that we want you to think about too.
Yeah.
Have you ever felt like there's a gap in how you understand the world? Especially when you have these, different belief systems, clashing explanations, like maybe when science doesn't have all the answers, especially in a personal crisis, or when your spiritual beliefs, they just don't seem to connect with what's happening in your everyday life.
Yeah, like they're two totally separate things.
Right. That's exactly the territory we're going to be exploring today.
So how did Hiebert try to make sense of all this? Well, he developed this framework, a way to analyze different worldviews. And at its heart are two key dimensions. First one, he called it the seen-unseen dimension. Think of it like a spectrum, right?
Okay, spectrum.
Yeah, and it stretches from the stuff we can directly observe with our senses all the way to what we believe exists beyond that in the unseen realm.
I like that. Seen, unseen.
At one end, we have the empirical world, the things we can see, touch, hear, taste, smell, everyday stuff. Hiebert pointed out that every culture, they develop their own folk sciences, their own traditional ways of explaining this realm. Like, to a Naga person, a deer dies because someone shot it with an arrow. A Karen wife knows that fire is what cooks her food.
Right. Those are like basic practical understandings of how the world works, right?
Exactly. And you're interacting with this all the time, like knowing how to use your phone or why plants need sunlight. It's just common sense, practical knowledge.
So what's on the other end of the spectrum?
As we move past what's immediately obvious, what we can directly observe, we start getting into the level of, well, Hiebert called them earthly, supernatural beings and forces.
Okay, so like what Give me some examples.
Things like spirits, ghosts, ancestors, local gods and goddesses who people believe live in specific places like trees, rivers, mountains. Also, concepts like mana. Remember that impersonal spiritual power that some cultures believe can reside in objects or people? Even magic and astrology.
Oh, yeah.
And Hiebert, he reminds us that these beliefs, they're not unique to, far-off cultures. Even in medieval Europe, people believed in trolls, pixies, fairies. They were considered totally real.
Interesting. So it's like a different layer of reality,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Not the everyday stuff, but not heaven or hell either.
Precisely. It's this middle ground. These beings aren't way out there somewhere. They're thought to be actively involved in our world. And then, at the furthest end of the spectrum, you have the transcendent realm. This is where you find your heavens and hells, your high gods, like the African high god, or the Hindu deities, Vishnu and Shiva, the Jewish Jehovah.
So the big players, so to speak.
Yeah, the ultimate powers.
Yeah.
And Hiebert points out that Jehovah in the Jewish tradition is really unique compared to, say, the Canaanite gods because he's so transcendent.
Okay, so more removed from the everyday world.
Exactly. And in this transcendent realm, you also have these big cosmic principles at play, like karma, the idea that your actions have consequences, this whole cause and effect system, or kismet, fate, destiny, these forces that are beyond our control. So what Hiebert's saying is when you come across beliefs about spirits and such, don't just dismiss them as, primitive superstition.
Right.
It's a different way of engaging with a level of reality that we in the West, we often just ignore.
That's really interesting. Okay, so we've got the seen-unseen dimension, this spectrum of reality from the everyday to the transcendent. What's the second part of Hiebert's framework?
So the second part is what he calls the organic mechanical continuum.
Okay, another continuum.
It helps us understand how people make sense of the world, the kind of analogies they use.
Analogies. Right?
Yeah, like metaphors. So the organic analogy, it sees the world as this web of living beings. Everything's connected through relationships. It's all about actions, reactions, feelings, intentions. Think about how we talk about things. Hiebert mentions thinkers like Spengler and Toynbee. They saw entire civilizations as having life cycles, like living organisms. They're born, they grow, they decline, they die.
Mm-hmm.
Or in many traditional religions, illness is often explained as being caused by an angry spirit. You need to appease the spirit to get better. And even in Christianity, the idea of a personal relationship with God, that fits right into this organic way of thinking. It's all about interaction, connection with a living being.
Okay, so it's seeing the world as this responsive, interconnected place. Things happen because of someone's will or intention.
Exactly.
Yep.
Now, on the other side of the continuum, we have the mechanical analogy. This view sees the world as a bunch of inanimate objects. They interact according to impersonal laws, like forces of nature.
So the opposite of the organic view.
Yeah, pretty much. Like gravity pulling a rock to the ground. There's no emotion, no intention there.
Right, just physics.
It's just physics. And Hiebert points out that Western science, even when it's dealing with living things, it often uses this mechanical analogy. Like, we see the human body as this complex machine.
All these systems working together.
Right, governed by impersonal forces. And these forces, they're amoral, not good or bad in themselves, just, the way things work.
So we've got these two contrasting ways of looking at the world, the organic and the mechanical. What's Hiebert's point here?
Well, the interesting thing is how magic, astrology, and modern science, even though they seem so different, they all use mechanistic analogies in a way.
Really? How so?
They're all trying to understand and to some extent control these forces, whether natural or supernatural, to get a specific outcome. Like in magic, you're trying to manipulate spiritual forces. In astrology, you're looking at the influence of celestial bodies.
And in science, you're figuring out the laws of nature.
Exactly. And this is where we see a major cultural difference. Hiebert points out that the West, we tend to have this very mechanical worldview, but many traditional religions, they see the world through a more organic lens. To them, the world is alive, filled with personalities and intentions.
So that leads us to what Hiebert calls the excluded middle.
Right.
It's that level of reality, that middle ground between what we can directly observe and the transcendent realm, the ultimate stuff.
Yeah.
That realm of earthly supernatural beings and forces. Hiebert's argument is that Western thought has basically ignored or excluded it.
Yeah, he called it uneasiness, this feeling that something was missing. You see, he was trained in science, so he was used to explaining the world in terms of natural laws and processes.
Makes sense.
And as a theologian, he was focused on these big questions about God, ultimate purpose, destiny.
But the stuff in the middle, the spirits, the ancestors, the unseen forces, they didn't fit neatly into either category.
Right. It was just dismissed as folklore, superstition, not worth serious consideration.
So how did we in the West end up with this two-tiered view of reality?
Well, Hiebert traces it back to some pretty influential figures. You've got Plato and his idea that the world is divided into these two separate realms, the physical and the spiritual.
Okay, dualism.
Yeah, dualism. And then later on, you have the rise of materialistic naturalism in science. This was during the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment and all that. It emphasized reason, observation, and the idea that everything could be explained through natural laws.
So science and religion basically went their separate ways.
Pretty much. Science became focused on the empirical world, using this mechanical way of explaining things. And religion, it often dealt with these otherworldly matters through organic analogies, faith, personal experience.
But what about the stuff in the middle?
Exactly. And this separation, it had some pretty big consequences, especially for Western missionaries who went to cultures where this middle level was, front and center in people's lives.
They were encountering a different worldview, a different way of understanding reality.
Exactly. And these missionaries, they often didn't have the tools, the conceptual framework to even talk about these things. Like when people ask them about spirits affecting their crops, causing illness, they didn't really have any meaningful answers. They were stuck in their own Western framework.
So they were kind of talking past each other.
Yeah, in a way. Hiebert even quotes Leslie Newbegin, another missiologist, who argued that Western missions, without meaning to, actually became a secularizing force because they dismissed these deeply held beliefs as mere superstition.
So they were unintentionally undermining people's faith in their own traditions.
Yeah, that's the argument. And it brings us to the kind of questions that are really at the heart of this middle level of reality. Hiebert says these are different from the questions that science typically asks.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, science is focused on the observable world, how things work, cause and effect. And religion grapples with these big questions about ultimate origins, purpose, destiny. But the questions of the middle level, they're more about the uncertainties of life, the crises we face, the unexplained events of the past.
Give me some examples.
Sure. Like, even with all our scientific knowledge, we can't predict accidents with 100% certainty, or guarantee a successful marriage, or prevent every illness. We still have so much uncertainty in our lives.
Yeah, that's true.
In the West, we often just chalk it up to luck or unforeseeable circumstances. But many cultures, they're not satisfied with that. They want to know why. They look for explanations and solutions within that middle level.
So they might attribute these things to ancestors, spirits, witchcraft, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Like a bad harvest might be blamed on an angry spirit. A sudden illness might be seen as a curse. They're looking for answers in the unseen realm.
What about questions about the past?
Yeah, like why did a child die? Who stole something? If there's no clear natural explanation, people might turn to the middle level for answers. Maybe an ancestor was displeased. Maybe someone used black magic.
So how do we make sense of all this? What are the implications, especially for people trying to understand different cultures or just seeking a more complete picture of reality?
Well, Hiebert's big takeaway is that we need what he calls holistic theologies. These are frameworks, ways of understanding God and the world that address all areas of life. They don't just ignore or dismiss the middle level.
So they bridge the gap between science and religion.
Exactly. And he says this holistic theology, it operates on 3 levels. The first is cosmic history. This is about God's role in creation, redemption, the whole grand narrative of the universe. It gives meaning to human history, to our individual lives.
So the big picture.
Yeah, the big picture. Then there's human history, and this is where the excluded middle becomes really important.
Okay, why?
Because this level is all about God's involvement in the affairs of nations, communities, individuals. And Hiebert says we need a theology that can address divine guidance, provision, healing. But also, and this is key, a theology that engages with the concepts of ancestors, spirits, the unseen forces that many cultures believe in. We also need a good theology of suffering, misfortune, death. Why do bad things happen?
Right, because those are questions that everyone wrestles with.
Exactly. And finally, there's natural history. This is about God's role in creating and sustaining the natural order, the everyday world.
But haven't we kind of separated God from the natural world in the West?
Yeah, and Hiebert says that's a problem. He argues that when we limit God's action to the supernatural and say that the natural world runs on its own according to scientific laws, we create a space for secularism to take root.
So it's like we're pushing God out of the picture.
Exactly. Now, Hiebert also warns us about two potential dangers when we start to re-engage with this middle level. The first is, well, secularism itself. Just denying that there is a spiritual realm at all and explaining everything in purely material terms. That's kind of the default position in modern science.
Right. And what's the other danger?
He calls it Christianized animism.
Okay, what's that?
It's the risk of, going too far in the other direction, like over-correcting and making spirits and magic the main explanation for everything. This can become really self-centered, all about manipulating spirits for personal gain. It loses sight of the bigger picture of God.
So how do we avoid these extremes? What's the right way to engage with this middle level?
Hiebert proposes a third way, a holistic theology that keeps God at the center. It's not secularism, denying the spiritual, and it's not animism, making spirits the ultimate power. It's a balanced approach.
Okay, I like that.
He emphasizes that the Bible itself, it takes spiritual realities seriously. God, angels, Satan, demons, these are real. But unlike animism, this God-centered view, it focuses on the big story, God's interaction with humanity.
It's about relationship, not just control.
Exactly. It's about our relationship with God, human responsibility, and the idea that creation operates according to his principles. It acknowledges the spirit world, but it says that our focus should be on God, our worship of him, not on trying to manipulate him or spiritual forces for our own benefit.
So how do we put all this into practice? How do we live in this middle space in a healthy way?
Well, Hiebert tells this story about Yelea, the church elder we talked about earlier. Remember the little girl who got sick with smallpox?
Yeah.
Well, sadly, a week after they prayed for her, she died. And Hiebert, he was devastated. He felt like their prayers had failed.
It makes you wonder, what do we expect when we pray? Are we just trying to get God to do what we want?
That's a good question. But here's the thing. Yelea, he came back to Hiebert later, and he was almost joyful. He said that while healing the girl would have been a powerful sign, the whole village saw something even more profound at her funeral.
What was that?
They saw the Christian hope, the belief in resurrection, in eternal life. And it started some really deep conversations, about the core beliefs of Christianity.
Wow, so it wasn't the answer they expected, but it was an answer nonetheless.
Exactly. And Hiebert realized that sometimes the most meaningful answers to prayer, they're not about getting what we want right now. It's about God being glorified.
There's a difference between genuine worship and just trying to use God to get what we want.
Exactly. And he stresses that we need to keep evaluating our beliefs. Test them against what the Bible says, and to be able to distinguish between what's part of the natural order, what might be the work of evil, and what truly demonstrates God's power.
So it's about discernment.
Yeah, it's about wisdom and discernment. And the central message, Hiebert says, should always be the greatness, the holiness, the power of God, and his constant work in rescuing us from evil and enabling us to live victorious lives through him.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've been exploring this idea of the flaw of the excluded middle. It's that tendency in Western thought to overlook, to dismiss that whole realm of earthly supernatural beings and forces, and how that can really limit our understanding of the world.
And how it can lead to misunderstandings, especially when we interact with other cultures where this middle level is a really important part of life. Hiebert's work challenges us to develop a more holistic view of reality, one that doesn't fall into the trap of secular denial or the imbalance of a spirit-centered worldview, but instead stays grounded in a God-centered understanding that can speak to every aspect of human experience.
And that brings us to our final question for you to ponder.
Yeah.
Thinking about your own background, your experiences, the way you make sense of the world, where might you be unknowingly operating with an excluded middle? What parts of reality might you be missing, or maybe misunderstanding because of it?
It's a good question to ask ourselves. And remember, we've only just scratched the surface of Hiebert's work. There's so much more to explore. So if you found this discussion interesting, we encourage you to, dive into the source material and keep digging.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable.
Yeah, thanks for listening.